God, we come this morning. We're listening for your still speaking voice to speak into our lives afresh once more. And so we ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts would be pleasing to you. And where we depart from your Spirit, O God, may that quickly fall away. Amen. Let's see. Well, how many of you have ever heard this saying? Not my circus, not my monkeys. It's an old Polish proverb. It's a way, right, for people to set a boundary. It's another way of saying, not my problem, not my responsibility. I reached out this week to a few of our congregation's mental health professionals, who I might add are absolutely amazing and very wise. And I asked them their opinion. Is this wisdom or is this folly? They said that for some people, especially those who have experienced trauma, this kind of boundary setting, distancing, detachment, is important, at least initially. It can also be helpful, they said, for those who are really enmeshed in an unhealthy, codependent relationship where there is some enabling of unhealthy behavior going on. Interestingly, one of them commented that perhaps the reason such sentiments and such proverbs have become such popular common wisdom recently is because of the current state of the world. We live with this heightened sense of anxiety. We are, in some senses, being traumatized by constant threats to our security and all the images we see come across our TV screens. And in such a world of high anxiety, it can be a very natural response to want to withdraw out of self-protection. Even in mundane, very everyday situations, in that kind of high-stress environment, it's easy to feel like I can hardly handle my own anxiety, much less take on or feel responsibility for anyone else's needs. So maybe you're sitting here this morning and you saw that not my circus, not my monkeys up here, and you thought, that gives me a little relief thinking about giving myself permission to say that in some of the situations going on in my own life. Maybe a situation that overwhelms me, or a difficult relationship, or some sort of situation full of drama. And maybe you feel that way because you too, like so many of us, are living with that heightened sense of anxiety. Last year, when the Florida Conference of the United Church of Christ met, a speaker who was with us shared with us this chart. You see, technological advancement has now outpaced our human ability to adapt. Think about that. Technology is advancing at a faster pace than we're able to change and adapt as human beings. Think about the kind of stress quite apart from the economy and the continued squeezing of the middle class and that heavier and heavier sense of inescapability for the poor, quite apart from all the fears about global warming and the witnessing of an increasing frequency and severity of natural disasters, quite apart from all those deepening divisions and the animosity across the political aisle, quite apart from all the racial and gender tensions that are finally coming to the surface in much needed ways, but in ways that don't allow the privileged to remain ignorant, quite apart from the misinformation campaigns and the never quite knowing what to believe or being able to find even common ground in the basic facts of reality, much less talk about what to do about them. Quite apart from all of that, simply the sheer pace of technological advances is overwhelming us. We can't learn that fast, adapt that fast. That alone is enough to leave us in a constant state of anxiety, let alone heap on all the rest. So it's no surprise that many of us feel this self-preservation thing inside of us kicking on, right? It tugs at us, telling us, pull back, withdraw, focus on self-care instead of other care. Occupied territory. The Jewish people and their lands were occupied by the Romans, and they were oppressed by the Romans. Fear and anxiety ran high. Jesus' people had also been traumatized by a rapidly changing world around them. In his time, many of the wealthy and the powerful among his people had chosen to look out for themselves instead of for the good of their people. They had agreed to be Rome's middlemen and extort their own people for the security of themselves and their families. The poor had consistently been organizing protests and revolts because living conditions had grown so desperate. It's in this context that Jesus and his family and a few of the disciples, the students who have started to follow him, attend a neighbor's wedding and the wine runs out. Now, we don't really know why. Maybe it was poor planning on the host's part, or maybe a bunch of guests arrived who had failed to RSVP, or maybe the budget for the wedding had been shattered when that corrupt tax collector most recently came by, always demanding more and more in taxes to pad his own pockets. Either way, it's a big deal, a much bigger deal than in our culture, that the wine has run out. Hospitality is of paramount value in their culture. Honor and shame are the social currency. The family is going to lose face over this lack of wine. And Mary, Jesus' mother, feels an incredible amount of compassion for their hosts and for this community shame that they will experience because of the insufficiency of wine. She asks for Jesus' help. Now, his response sounds almost modern in his detachment, certainly not characteristic of the ancient Middle Eastern culture. But perhaps in that high-stress environment, there was a refrain continually running, "There's not enough." And it had grown so loud and so frequent that even Jesus had grown a bit numb to it. He replies to Mary essentially, "Not my circus, not my monkeys." In other words, this is not my wedding. It's not my responsibility. Why should I care that the wine has run out? You might recall a similar incident in Matthew and Mark's Gospels when a Syrophoenician woman comes to Jesus and she's begging him to heal her daughter. And he replies to her basically, "Lady, your people aren't my people, not my responsibility." And perhaps most disturbingly, refers to her people as dogs. And yet, she convinces him to help her anyway. Jesus' great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother, you might recall, at least according to Matthew, is Ruth. And Ruth, if you remember, was the one who, after her husband and her brother-in-law and her father-in-law all die, decides that even though she has no technical obligation to care for her mother-in-law, she's going to make this woman her responsibility, her family, saying, "Your people will be my people. Your circus will be my circus." And it's through that choice of Ruth's that, at least Matthew says, the biblical story of the lineage down to King David and then eventually to Jesus begins. It appears that Jesus in his ministry, with that Syrophoenician woman at this wedding, is given the opportunity to live into that same kind of love that Ruth did. To, like her, set aside all of his carefully laid plans and open a way forward by choosing to have compassion on someone and take responsibility for his neighbors in a way that goes way above and beyond expectation. On this day, it's Mary who invites Jesus into such a life and ministry. She's the one who sees in him the potential to do more than what is expected, to rise above their anxiety-filled times that make people want to pull in and care only for themselves. She sees in him the ability to do something counterintuitive, to love and to care anyway, to love and care extravagantly. You know, in that kind of high-stress environment where the little stuff often seems like it doesn't matter anymore, the little kindnesses like they don't matter anymore, Mary teaches Jesus that, in fact, those are exactly what matter. They are what make a difference. And the choice that Jesus makes on that day to lean in and help this family will, of course, mark and set the course for his entire ministry. You might remember that when Jesus and his disciples are trying to withdraw and pull away one day, get on a boat and go over to the other side, suddenly all these crowds show up, right? And the disciples say, "Oh, send them home. We don't have enough food for them." And Jesus turns to the disciples and said, No, you feed them, right? Jesus learned at this wedding how to do that. You know, when people first started sharing this Polish saying with each other, "Not my circus, not my monkeys," parents pushed back rather humorously with sayings like this: "The moment you realize, this is my circus, and these are my monkeys." Parents, of course, do have an obligation and a responsibility to their children. But wouldn't it be nice to see people claim that kind of responsibility, not just for those whom it is expected they care for, but even those they have no duty or obligation to, those who are strangers? After all, right, that's what the story of the Good Samaritan is all about. By the time Jesus shares with his followers that parable of the Good Samaritan about a stranger extravagantly caring for another stranger in a way that defies expectations, Jesus has made thousands of decisions, like the one he makes this day at the wedding, to lean in, to take on and respond to the needs of others, to choose that world-changing power of love instead of anxiety and fear and that resulting inclination to pull away, to withdraw, to put up that self-protective wall. Oh, here's an even better one. Turns out they are my monkeys and it is my circus. I'm the freaking ringmaster. Tomorrow we celebrate Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. King once observed, "In a real sense, all life is interrelated. All men are caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality." Friends, what if we really took that to heart? What if we took King's invitation, Mary's invitation, Ruth's invitation, Jesus' own invitation to care for those beyond ourselves, beyond the boundaries of expectation? What if we chose to defy all of that anxiety that we feel and that beckons us to close up shop, to ignore compassion and empathy, and instead decided, I'm going to lean in. We're going to take responsibility for each other, in healthy ways, of course. And what if we chose to let our carefully laid plans be interrupted by the needs of others? This weekend we were rewatching one of our favorite family movies, introducing my dad to it, Paddington. When an earthquake destroys the home of these bears in Peru and kills Paddington's uncle, Pastuzo, his Aunt Lucy sneaks him into a cargo boat bound for London, and she gives him these directions, referencing World War II. She says, you know, there was once a war in that country. Thousands of children were sent away for safety, left at railway stations with labels around their necks, and unknown families took them in and loved them as their own. She says, surely they will not have forgotten about how to treat a stranger. Except, of course, when Paddington arrives in London, the people have indeed forgotten how to care for a stranger. The movie and that reference reminded me that there have been times in our history when we are in anxious and terrorizing situations, and yet we have chosen to lean in and to care for each other instead of pull away. And I realized, we could do that again if we chose to. Friends, we live in an anxious world where we're constantly being told there's not enough and told to hoard whatever we can for ourselves. And sometimes, as our mental health professionals so helpfully reminded me this week, there are times and there are situations where we do have to care for ourselves, where we do have to set some hard boundaries. But let us never forget that mutual responsibility we have for each other. Let us never forget that the world won't change through our self-care if it stops right there, if it doesn't move out and empower and fuel our care for everyone else. In today's story, Jesus learns how to meaningfully, extravagantly, compassionately join the party of beloved community. We can too. Can you imagine if Dr. King, looking around at the messy, chaotic, deeply harmful, toxic world of racism and white supremacy surrounding him, a problem not of his own making or even his race's own making, had said, those white people, not my circus, not my monkeys, not my problem, not my responsibility. He certainly could have done so. He would have had every reason to do so. He had no obligation to work to fix this problem he didn't make. But remarkably, he chose to accept mutual responsibility for his fellow humanity. And he did so, I believe, in large part because of his faith and his call to follow in the way of Jesus. He chose, like Ruth, to say, you know what? I choose to make these people my people. He seemed to know that that was the only way forward, that withdrawal might provide this healing balm for a time, but it wouldn't make the kind of lasting change for which he and the world longed for. So I encourage you, take the moments of self-care that you need. We all need them, and Jesus did too. He took those moments throughout his ministry. But don't stay there. Fight against the anxieties within you that make you want to stay and never return. Fight against that resistance and reluctance in you that wants to hold you back from helping. Lean into compassion. Choose to be the beloved community to your neighbors, even to your enemies. Thankfully, we believe in a God who chooses us, though I'm sure there are moments when God wants to say, "Not my circus, not my monkeys." Instead, God leans in, has compassion for us, loves us, and seeks justice and mercy for us. May we do likewise for each other. Amen. Friends, may you please rise.